Hey everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research, and we're here with our continuing and final coverage for Hispanic Heritage Month, which technically goes to Columbus Day. We don't really recognize Columbus Day, so we're going to stop now. And we have a documentary for you guys, quite an about-face turn from Coco. We like to have a broad spectrum of discussions on our YouTube channel. So we chose the 2016 documentary When Two Worlds Collide, which is on Netflix. I know we had said we were going to do one about the Venezuelan beauty competition industry, but it was not available on a free streaming service. So stay tuned. We'll watch it some other time and tell you about it. When Two Worlds Collide is basically a complicated version of Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest, if you've seen that film from Dr. Donnelly and I's childhood, and follows the story of competing interests for resources in the Peruvian Amazon. The Peruvian government wants economic investment and using the resources of oil and lumber to further the economy of Peru, and the indigenous communities do not want the development. And it sets up a standoff between Alberto Pizango and Alan Garcia, Pizango representing the indigenous communities political organization, and Garcia representing, he's the president of Peru, although they have a prime minister as well. And I meant to look up the governmental structure of Peru. Is it like Ireland? I don't know.
A little bit, yeah. Although the president has actual legislative power.
He has actual power, yeah. But so does the prime minister.
Correct. And I think it's a little bit, from what I was reading, a little bit like president and vice president, except they can be from competing parties. And then just like in Britain, where people refer to the party in power as the government, it's not like here in America, when we say the government, we mean a system. Most of the rest of the world, when they say the government, they mean a party.
Right.
And they mean the party in power. And so Garcia's party was in power. Interestingly, I also learned, by the way, that voting is compulsory in Peru from 18 to 70. And it is punished by fines if you don't vote.
Ooh.
Interesting, yeah. Which is evidently controversial, so I'm going to be digging into that later. But compulsory voting.
Well, okay.
Yeah, so they're a republic, a democratic republic, and it appears to have it's a tricameral legislature, just like we are. They have the courts, the Congress, and but it's a hybrid of what Ireland has and what maybe kind of we have, and it maybe was based on Brazil, and then I ran out of time on my rabbit trail. The current government exists since 1993. That's their most recent constitution, is 1993. Ooh. And this confrontation that this documentary is about occurs in 2009. Yeah. So the entire system is 16 years old.
That's crazy. I had no idea it was that young.
16 years old. They were, and by the way, your presidency is 5 years, and you cannot run it for consecutive terms.
Oh, interesting.
So there is no re-election campaigns. You run once, and then you can run again, but they will not allow 10 consecutive years of one leader. And
this was like in the middle of his term, I think, because
he left in 11.
11, yeah. So this is towards the end of his term. So we have a couple thematic points that I want to make, and then Dr. Kristen has some dramaturgical editing, filmmaking points that she wants to make. We're a bit divided on whether to recommend this to everyone universally. I think it's a very important story for empathy building. It's very similar to a lot of other stories, and Dr. Kristen has some very cogent thoughts about why she doesn't like it or recommend it in terms of what the filmmaking does. But it's, I feel, an important story for highlighting indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon, which I knew nothing about, and I looked up afterwards. So that's what I love about documentaries, is they give you enough information, but they can't give you all of it. And Dr. Kristen and I, as you could tell, are both people that are like, what else can we find out? So there's like 500 tribes in the Amazon. And if you've been following what's happening in Brazil with the Brazilian Amazon and President Bolsonaro and his fight with indigenous communities. It's very similar to what happened in Peru as well. So anytime we can get the voices of indigenous communities on a platform like this, I would like to thank Leo DiCaprio for putting a lot of money behind this. I'm assuming he did as an executive producer. I would also like him to maybe next time invest a little bit more in the style of filmmaking.
And in a different editor, but we'll get that later.
He makes so much money. I think what they were really great at conveying was the deep pain felt by the indigenous people over this issue. And we talked about it just now offline. It's a really fascinating story that for the bulk of the documentary, we are kind of like, oh, well, who's the bad guy here? And like, what's happening? This is really complicated. I can see what the Peruvian government's trying to do, but
so really, really quick, basically, because whether or not you watch this or not, we want you to know the story. So the Alan, I believe is how they pronounce it. President Garcia entered into heavy negotiations with President Bush before 2008, when President Bush was no longer President Bush, to create a free trade agreement between Peru and the United States.
Yeah.
And the reason that he did this was to allow transnational companies, especially in petroleum, because Peru, in terms of natural resources, is incredibly rich in petroleum, to allow them to come in. Now, under a couple UN guidelines and even the Peruvian constitution itself, for him to do this, he needed indigenous consultation. And he, for any number of reasons, including the fact that I think he thinks very poorly of indigenous populations, he chose not to, and his government chose not to. And so what essentially occurred is that through some political machinations where he seemed to pull the wool over the eyes of quite a lot of people in Congress as well, the Peruvian government began to sell off parcels of land to transnational petroleum companies that were not just American. So good news, guys, we're not the only bad guys in this story. Good news. Kind of right underneath the noses of the indigenous people who were living on that land. And obviously they don't believe fundamentally that land can be sold because they are stewards of it and not owners of it. And so there's a real ideological clash, but at the same time, Peru is broke and they need a GDP and they need to have jobs in their country. And so this is when we say it's complicated, this is why. Like, you can understand why Garcia needed to jumpstart an economy. He did it really poorly. And you can understand why they're pissed because what happened to them was illegal against treaties. I don't think they're actually treaties. I think they're legitimate pieces of the Constitution.
It was a law written into the Constitution that the indigenous communities were like recognized ownership of that land, I think. And that they had to be consulted before the government passed any laws. And so there was the free trade agreement, and then based off the free trade agreement, Garcia passed like 3 or 4 laws that allowed for transnational companies to come in and buy the land.
And so the story of the documentary is the story of the fight between, like Dr. Aaron mentioned, Pisongo. I just kept calling him Alberto in my heart. So Alberto Pisongo and the sitting government of Peru. And through the beginning of this particular battle was very political. There was, at least one member of Garcia's government was willing to come to the table and willing to negotiate and to try to find a solution. The political organization that Alberto represents were not willing to negotiate. Their demands, and he used that word frequently, were that all of those laws be repealed immediately because they were all unconstitutional. The government was like, well, what do you want to negotiate? And he was like, I want to negotiate nothing. And so we reached an impasse, and the indigenous people began essentially to shut down the country by blocking roads and having peaceful protests. And a bit of the documentary covers the national reaction to that, which was fascinating.
Yeah.
And then kind of what Dr. Hinson and I both offline said was the turning point of the documentary was that there's an opportunity to debate on the floor one of the laws in particular, 1090, the forestry law, and the government strong arms it into being taken off the table for debate.
Yeah.
In what would be a very familiar move to many Americans. And then the next day, guns started happening.
Yeah. And so for me, it was, I mean, they showed that happening as it happened chronologically. And then they had an interview with a government official after the clash, as they kept calling it, between protesters and the military police. And he said, you know, he kind of outlined it, the argument for her. And he was like, yes, but on the Thursday, you refused a vote on the law. And on the
even a debate, like, yeah. It was nuts. Yeah.
You basically called for a vote before all the people were on the floor manipulating the governmental structures so that you didn't have to even have a debate. And then the next day you sent in guns. Like, you gave the Indigenous communities no time to react or respond, or like they were already upset, and then guns happened. So that's the real turning point. A massacre takes place on both sides. I think about 15 Indigenous people were killed in the end, and 38 police officers.
There was 11 police officers killed
during the clash, but then the 38 police officers at Station 6 were taken hostage.
Oh, Station 6, that's right. Yeah, I don't know if anybody died at Station 6. I don't remember.
I don't know what happened to those police officers.
They didn't finish that story.
They didn't finish that story, yeah. So then it becomes a little bit more black and white. It's still very complicated. There was a lot happening. Pizango goes into exile for a year, all these things. To say that it was a fascinating exploration for me. I found value in the story, but not in the storytelling. And I will turn it over for Dr. Kristen. I didn't love the filmmaking. She really didn't love the filmmaking. So I'll let her explain her critiques about it, because it's an important point when you're talking about highlighting a story like of such importance as this, and you can really do damage to the message of the film if it's not made well.
And that's where I'm at. Like, I'm angry because this story deserves to be better told, and Leonardo DiCaprio had the money to tell it better. And so, like, this isn't a student film project that I should be giving grace to. Like, this could have been on the festival circuit. You have compelling dramaturgically, you have compelling narrative, you've got, you know, in-person footage, you have some people willing to sit down for interviews, like, you've got it all. Yeah. There was a couple things they didn't do. They did not give us a timeline at like any point in time, really, to tell us where we were chronologically in the world. There's a difference between like hand-holding your audience and trusting them too much. And the people that, especially in documentaries, that tell that well are the people that walk that balance. Mm. But one of the ways that we as Western humans know what often we mark where we are in the 21st century is by camera quality. And there are so many different kinds of cameras used. We have some phone cameras, we've got professional cameras, we've got, I don't even know what was on somebody's head as they were running. Like, you can't, as far as I know now, looking back, all of that was in 2009.
Yes, until, and then into 2000, but the trial was like 2014.
Yeah. We should not be confused about this if the documentarians did their job.
And at one point they said in the corner in little white lettering 2009, but then like I didn't know where and how, like over what part and how long it was taking place. And like the point Dr. Kristen just made, I want to briefly interject, because it like they used all these different resources that they had, which was great. But like, tell me, just put a little thing that says like cell phone footage.
Yeah, or even, because also the cell phone footage is rough, not only in that it's not greatly edited. And I know what Final Cut Pro looked like in 2016, so I'm even more like, oh, come on, guys, you could have cleaned this up a little bit. It is visually rough because it's really shaky. Obviously, people were running. but almost all the clips go just a little bit too long too. Like they had like the way I felt was that the filmmakers were in love with all of their material and no one told them to kill their darlings.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, like I timed it 12 minutes watching like wounded bodies writhing in the streets. I didn't need that 12 minutes. But I get that you wanted us to understand how serious it was. There's other ways to do that than spending 12 minutes showing us what is essentially BBC News footage that I'm so sorry to say also we are all fairly immune to now.
Yeah.
And so like, how do you, to me, they were, yeah, I'm annoyed more than Dr. Hinson is simply because she's more gracious than I am for this kind of stuff. But this story deserves to be told really, really well, and it could have been. So they didn't ever actually tell us a story. They were telling 3 different stories. And so because they told way too many, they didn't tell any of them well. They didn't finish any of them. Like I should know there was 38 people taken hostage at a petroleum station. What happened there? Yeah, you have multiple leaders of the indigenous movement, but then you never explain how they're connected to Alberto, even if they are at all. Tell us the structure of this organization that he's a part of. They throw around a lot of things and they never follow up on it. Like for instance, one of the things that was fascinating to me is that one of the workers at the petroleum station, who I believe was taken hostage, but I don't remember, maybe was just working, says that on the radio called the clash a genocide.
Yeah, I think it was one of the officers that was
one of the officers
taken hostage. Yeah, so clearly he survived because he
survived. Yeah, so they called it a genocide, and that incited everybody. Hold that moment, filmmakers. That's massive. That's media inflammation. That word didn't come from Alberto. It came from the media. So hold that, chase that. It was just like,
yeah,
it all just got muddy. And because I was struggling so much to follow the timeline, I didn't get sucked in, because whenever they jump to something, I'd be like, okay, where are we? What's happening? I needed a lot more context. And not like a Peruvian history lesson, although obviously I would always love a Peruvian history lesson. But within documentary filmmaking, like if you look at like what Alex Gibney does with all of his, he's taking really complicated things, like none of us know Scientology, and yet he's still able to unpack a story of what this looks like. You know, the people that did The Keepers on Netflix, the people that do some other ones. And it's just a shame. So it's important, like, as Dr. Aaron said, to start this process, if you have a very compelling story to tell, which by the way, most of us do in our lives, we've lived compelling stories or we've come across them, or if you are living life with people, there's ways to tell stories. The craft of storytelling is as important as the message itself. And so that's why I don't recommend this documentary wholeheartedly to everyone. I don't know if people who aren't super into Indigenous rights already, I don't think this would compel them to get into it. I worry. If you are already into Indigenous rights, like Dr. Aaron and myself are, this is a great exploration. Take the time, definitely learn about it in a country that you maybe don't know about. Because there's a couple small things, like they consider themselves Peruvians and Indigenous, which is rare in our understanding of a lot of Indigenous populations. So that was fascinating. But I'm going to go try to find if there's an article write-up on this, or if there's something that's a little bit more accessible to a lot more people, because that's what I want to share. I'm not sure I want to share this documentary with people for whom, when they were maybe taken out of it, they'd turn it off. And that's my worry. So.
Yeah, so for our coverage of Hispanic Heritage Month, we liked the idea of talking about the intersection of Indigenous communities and, national communities. Tricky wording in Peru, especially since there's overlap with that. And it's important to remember that, no culture is a monolith. It's called Hispanic Heritage Month. That encompasses a lot of people. from a lot of different cultural backgrounds and linguistic traditions and all of that. And so we hoped with our coverage this month to highlight that distinction, which is why we went intentionally to South America as well, because a lot of people think, you know, Hispanic is just Mexico and the Caribbean and maybe Central America. So we hope you've enjoyed our Hispanic Heritage Month coverage. Stay tuned for more History and Heritage Months and our continuing coverage of them, because we feel very strongly that representation matters and that these months are an important mechanism for us to explore stories that we don't know. So with that in mind, we will see you all next time.
Bye.